All right, hello everyone. Let's get today's event started. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and you are joining us for another edition of Committee for Sydney Live. Today's talk is Automation Anxiety and the Future of Work with Dr. Carl Frey, the director of the program on the future of work at the University of Oxford. I want to start with an acknowledgement of country, which is something we always do in person, but I want to start doing it more consistently with these online events as well. Those of you not in Australia may know this is a tradition that I really love for events here in Australia. I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. While you may be in a different part of Sydney or a different part of the world, I am currently on the lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal people who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. Our topic today is something that probably everyone who thinks about economic policy has to contend with, and that's automation, as well as the social and political response to automation. Probably for as long as capitalism has been around, maybe even earlier, this has been an issue. There is a long-term trend of new inventions, new technology, making certain forms of work obsolete. But it's not constant. There are periods of more intense economic change, more intense technological change, and there are periods of more intense anxiety about this change. Even if you believe that in the long run, new forms of work are always created to replace the work that goes away, there can still be intense disruption and even a lot of personal tragedy at the scale of people's actual lived lives. So this is a serious issue, as it always has been. Dr. Carl Frey has studied these issues for years. He has served as an advisor and consultant to think tanks, governments, the OECD, the European Commission, the United Nations, and Fortune 500 companies. His work has been featured in more than 100 media outlets, including The Economist, Foreign Affairs, The New York Times, Time Magazine, Le Monde, and many others. His most recent book, from which some of these ideas today will be drawn, was The Technology Trap. It was selected as a Financial Times Best Books of the Year in 2019. So the way this works, those of you who have done this will know, Dr. Frey will give his talk, then we will open it up to questions, which you can submit via the Q&A app on Zoom. So with that, Dr. Frey, I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Gabriel, for that very kind introduction. It's really good to be with you this morning, although it is an early morning here in Oxford. So let's see if I can get some slides up. So I thought what I would do today is sort of take you through some of the arguments from the book that came out last year, and then move into more contemporary events regarding COVID-19, automation anxiety, and the future of work. And I will try to tie it all up together and see how it fits with the arguments of the book. So the basic sort of question of the book is, should we be concerned if the future of automation mirrors the past? And I start off with the case of the lamplighter. So about a century ago in Oxford and other cities across Europe, street lights were lit by lamplighters who walked the streets each evening with torches and lanterns. And as cities electrified, these jobs naturally disappeared, and this was not an entirely smooth process. In Brussels, for example, lamplighters went on strike when they heard the news that the city was about to be electrified. Police were sent out to resolve the riots, and the entire situation escalated, ended with the lamplighters raiding police headquarters, and the army had to be sent in to resolve the situation. Now, for contemporary commentators, it is easy to ridicule people like the lamplighters who went on strike for being backward about that, because if we look at the very long run, incomes have improved, or our lives has improved enormously as a result of technological progress. So for most of history, incomes per capita were stagnant. They really first took off after the first industrial revolution with the first machine age, if you like, which allowed us to produce more with fewer people as factories mechanized. And that in turn allowed people to earn higher wages. And people in Britain today are roughly 30 times better off in incomes per capita adjusted for inflation as a result of 2 centuries of mechanization. And some of you will obviously think, well, that must indeed understate the progress that has taken place, because it doesn't account for the fact that the income you earn today, with a lot of consumer goods and products and services are available to you that wasn't available during the first industrial revolution. So people back then could only look at the lives of the wealthy and envy, who had servants to do the most tedious things for them. Today, just about everyone in the industrial West has access to the electric servant that relieves us of a lot of tedious work at home, not to mention other inventions like mass-produced antibiotics, hopefully soon a mass-produced vaccine, automobiles, telephones, and so on and so forth. And I think perhaps the best evidence of improvement in our lives are the improvements we see in our working lives. So during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people worked in coal mines. Cave-ins and explosions were part of everyday working life. Lung disease often part of the work package. And today, their grandchildren have shifted into air-conditioned offices. And even if you look at occupations that existed back then, like the work of a farm laborer, the farm laborer of 1900 would walk the fields with nothing more than animal power. A farm laborer today can sit in a tractor and listen to the music of his choice. So earning those higher incomes, producing those new goods and services has become a lot more comfortable as well, in large part because of technological change. So this long run story of economic and technological change has been an enormous success story for ordinary people. And unfortunately, it is also just half of the story. So if we go back to the first industrial revolution, which unleashed this process of mechanization and allowed us to earn much higher incomes, what did people say and what did people think about the industrial revolution back then? Well, people certainly had very different views on it. So Benjamin Disraeli, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, wrote a novel called Coningsby, in which one character remarks that I see cities people with machines. Certainly Manchester must be the most wonderful place of modern times. The very same year that Coningsby came out, Frederick Engels published his Conditions on the Working Class, which was written during precisely a stay in Manchester. And Engels, needless to say, had a very different take on the matter. So he argued that machinery only served to downgrade working people, put pressure on their wages and incomes, and he even argued that it was dehumanizing to be put in the repetitive motions of machinery. Now, we all know that Engels was wrong about the long run, because we are much better off today, and Engels certainly didn't think that would be possible. But he was actually quite on target about the period he lived through, because for 7 decades during the classic period of the first industrial revolution, wages were stagnant and probably even falling at the lower end of the income distribution. If we look at other indicators than wages, such as consumption or such as biological indicators of well-being, such as heights, you find that the cohorts born in 1750 were taller than the cohorts born in 1850, suggesting also that they were better fed, among other things. So even as the British economy took off and grew by 50%, the gains from growth did not trickle down to the average person. And the reason for that was that we saw a very similar trend in the labor market to what we've seen today. We saw hollowing out of middle-income artisan jobs that were frequently displaced by children working in the factories. And indeed, early spinning machines were specifically designed to be tended by children and take advantage of pools of cheap labor. They were the robots of the Industrial Revolution, if you like. And it took some time for people to adjust, to acquire new skills. And it was only really after 1840, when steam was introduced, that children could no longer be productive workers in the factories, because those machines were very heavy and required adult labor. And it took time for the machinery to become standardized, because without standardized machinery, workers didn't have any decent outside options. They couldn't really probably threaten to leave. And it's only when the machinery becomes standardized and people can move around that increases the bargaining power. And as James Besson has argued as well, that was a key driver of the upsurge in wages after 1840. Now, a key question then becomes, why would people voluntarily have agreed to participate in the industrialization process if it reduced their utility? The simple answer to that is that they did not. They rioted against the mechanist factory on several occasions. And while much of the public commentary is focused on the Luddite riots in particular, they were only part of a long wave of riots that swept across Britain, continental Europe, India, and even China. And one thing that I argue in the book is that before the Industrial Revolution, resistance to machinery that threatened people's skills were the norm rather than the exception. And the Britain was different in the sense that it was the first country to really enforce the introduction of machinery on large scale. And troops on several occasions clashed with rioters. And Britain essentially enforced industrialization on the working population. Most people were politically disenfranchised, voting required property ownership, and so they voted with sticks and stones rather than showing up at the ballots. And this was indeed a period of rapid technological change, but also rapid societal polarization and a lot of social unrest. Now, the point is not to suggest that we are living through the same period over again, and I'm not predicting a socialist revolution, but I think it is noteworthy that if you look at Britain and the United States in particular, levels of inequality have been approaching levels not seen since the first industrial revolution. And the driver of this is clearly not textile machinery or steam engines, but in large part computer technology. And it is certainly true that computerization, it goes a long way back. The first electronic computer was developed at the University of Pennsylvania in 1947, but it consisted of something like 18,000 vacuum tubes. It would probably have taken the entire University of Oxford to store it and host it. And as a result of that, it didn't have any impact whatsoever on employment or people's wages. It took the microprocessor and the personal computer for computers to be adopted at mass scale. And that allowed, on the one hand, businesses to coordinate production at distance, take advantage of cheap labor in countries like China. And secondly, it allowed them to automate away a lot of work. And as you can see on this slide here, this is data from the United States. From the 1980s onwards, as computer technologies become more adapted, wages began to decouple from productivity growth, suggesting that technological change start to replace people's skills rather than augmenting them in a happy way. Now, I'm totally open to the idea that there are other factors that play into this, but I'm going to focus on technology here because it's a sort of key theme of my presentation. And I think what you can see on this slide is that it is not just really a question of rising inequality. So some groups in the labor market have actually been made worse off as a result of automation and globalization. And what you can see here, again, this is data from the United States, is that the wages for college-educated men and women have been increasing. They've been able to export their ideas and services globally due to digital technology, and they've been able to use it, writing books, doing analysis, all sorts of things. Those jobs have become more productive as a result of computer technology. But there are a lot of jobs that have not. And if you look at particularly men with no more than a high school degree, their wages have actually been falling by roughly 30% since the 1980s. So it's not just a matter of rising inequality. Their earnings capacity in the labor market has been significantly diminished. And one of my favorite lines from the book is that if you put one hand in this freezer and the other on the stove, you should be feeling quite comfortably on average. But we know from experience that that is not the case. And I think the same can be said about the labor market. Now, the labor market is obviously in a very different state today because of COVID. But even before COVID, there were large regional disparities in employment and non-employment. And in particular, there were lots of these prime-age men with no more than a high school degree who had dropped out of the workforce altogether. And what you can see is that, first of all, much of the discontent has where the robots are, and robots didn't affect America uniformly, right? And they're mainly clustered in states like Michigan, which has more robots than the entire American West. And you can see that it's very much focused around Rust Belt yellow. And if you were to put up a map of Chinese import competition, you would see that China actually hit America under the Rust or under the Rust Belt. Robots are a distinctive phenomenon because they are really in the Rust Belt. And that's most of these contents are, and most of the states that swung the 2016 election in favor of Trump. So Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania have been won by the Democratic candidate since 1992. In 2016, suddenly they opted for Trump. What we found in the study is that automation was a large part of the reason. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that people felt that, well, because of automation, I'm going to opt for Trump. But if you look at the impacts of automation and globalization on the labor market, both have had very significant effects. We've already seen a backlash against globalization, a backlash against China, partly as a result of this. But with regard to automation, we have seen nothing yet. The rise of China has already happened. It's not going to happen a second time. Most people today are non-traded sectors of the economy. They're relatively shielded from future globalization, but they are not shielded from future automation. And as a result of this, I think we should be concerned that the sentiment of globalization today could all happen with regard to automation, especially because of the advances we see in machine learning and artificial intelligence. So up until very recently, automation was largely confined to these routine activities. You can have specified top-down in computer code in advance for them to be automated. The difference this time around is that computers are increasingly capable of learning the rules of the game themselves by tapping into our experience in terms of the data trails we leave behind. So, for example, if you think about autonomous vehicles being used in hospitals or in mines, for example, it's much easier for a programmer to specify every situation the technology could encounter, because there are just not that many situations it can encounter, right? It's a very relatively structured environment. It's very different from, let's say, driving in city traffic, where the sort of number of situations you could encounter a computer programming world that could foresee all of them and write them down in computer code, and if so, millions and billions of lines of code. So the around this is to use machine learning, use large data sets of people running, and trying to predict what will the driver do in this given situation. And it is certainly true that autonomous cars are not yet perfect. It's certainly true that other machine learning algorithms in machine translation and other things are not perfect yet either. I think it's still important to remember that every revolution in technology has started with imperfect technology. So the steam engines, for example, were merely used to drain coal mines, and that they didn't do particularly well. Eventually, they became the prime movers of the first revolution, and I think artificial intelligence has the potential of doing the same. I think we tend to underestimate the potential scope of automation, in part for two reasons. One is that it's a question of comparative advantage. It's not the question of being perfect. Human drivers make mistakes too, and I think that's important to keep in mind. Secondly, I think one reason that we tend to automate automation is that we tend to assume that the technology has to perform exactly the type of tasks that we do in our jobs in order to replace us. But we didn't automate away the jobs of lamplighters by building robots capable of climbing lampposts. We didn't automate away the jobs of laundresses by building robots that would walk out of the home, chopping down trees, carry buckets of water wood into the home, heat water on the stone, perform the motions of hand washing. We did that by inventing the electric washing machine, which does an entirely different set of procedures. And as a result of that, these tasks are, or many tasks, not are automated. That said, there are still critical automation. We discussed this in 2013 paper authored by Michael Osborne, professor of machine learning at Oxford University. And in that paper, we identified three key bottlenecks to automation, being creativity, complex social interactions, and perception and manipulation tasks. And to just give you one example, so when it comes to complex social interactions, the state of the art in machine learning, I think, is best captured by these Turing test competitions, where chatbots try to convince human judges of them being human judges chat with other humans and the chatbots, and by the conversation they distinguish between the two. And back in 2015, people argued that there was a breakthrough because one chatbot actually managed to convince 30% of human judges of it being a person. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old orphan Russian boy speaking English as a second language, understanding of English culture. And if you think about the variety of much more complex social interactions you do in your daily jobs, and where you try to persuade people, where you try to motivate members of your team, it's almost inconceivable that we will have technology substituting for human workers in such things. Now, a key question is obviously how intensive then are jobs in tasks that correspond to this engineering bottlenecks automation. And what we find is that there are a variety of jobs that are actually not as intensive as in those tasks that we would have expected. So anything from a lot of jobs in material moving, transportation, food preparation, construction, back office work are heavily automatable. And when we published this study, we also published a list of 702 occupations and their relative exposure to automation. You can imagine that some people sort of went through this list by thinking, well, this isn't this silly. You found that fashion models are exposed to automation. And these fashion models on this picture actually have been created what's called generative adversarial networks through thousands of pictures. They are in Instagram, they're already being used. So a lot of unexpected things turns out is automatable with machine learning. Now, focusing on replacement only obviously understates the transformation because it doesn't take into account all the sort of second and third order effects. So if you think about electrification of factories, for example, factories did early on, merely replacing the steam engine as the central power source of the factory with its own with an electric motor, and then all of these shafts, counter shafts, factory, sort of the overall design of the factory, completely intact. And it actually took about 4 decades for experimentation for engineers to figure out that, well, we can actually equip every single machine with its own electric motor, and then we can sequence the machines according to the natural flow of production. which gave rise to mass production and allowed Henry Ford to produce the Model T at a sufficiently low price for it to become the people's vehicles. And as it did, right, it created new vast industries as more consumer goods became available to average people, created a lot of new jobs, and gave the economy significant growth in terms of productivity. That took a long time. The first order effect is substitution. And you might speculate what had happened during the revolution if the Dutch indeed had a political voice, as fortunately most people in the West have today. And the economist Leon, for example, once joked that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out different. They may have used their political voice to bring the introduction of the tractor to standstill. Now, I was surprised to find out that, and this is data from a recent Pew Research survey, that the majority of Americans, even before this crisis, were actually in favor of restrictions on machines to limit the number of jobs that can be replaced. The picture you can see here are dock workers in Los Angeles Harbor who went on strike the other year because of fears over autonomous trucks in the harbor. We saw in the state of Missouri people similarly going on strike, truck drivers, because of the fear of autonomous trucks. And we're seeing some of this coming back even before crisis. And the question is obviously, what is the crisis itself going to do to automation anxiety? Well, if we look back historically, I don't think it's a coincidence that much of the automation anxiety actually happened during or in the aftermath of recession. So the Luddite riots, for example, happened during the Napoleonic War, and more importantly, during the Continental Blockade, which caused enormous disruption to British trade, the British as a whole, and as a consequence of that faced worsening job options, and I think that exacerbated machinery riots during this period. So machinery riots were common, but they were even more common in the Continental Blockade. During the Great Depression, that was another episode of automation anxiety. It started off actually before the Great Depression, but became much worse during the Depression. And the National Recovery Act, introduced by President Roosevelt, actually even include several restrictions on the introduction of machinery industries, because also, again, of the fear of jobs, which was the main problem then, getting people back to work. I think they misjudged the situation with these machinery restrictions. Nonetheless, this is something that you see on a regular basis. You see the three post-Korean War recessions, again an upsurge in automation anxiety, and you also see it during or in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and justifiably so, because automation has not, as Gabriel mentioned, has not been a steady process. Right? Automation has often come in spurts, and more recently, often during the recessions, as businesses try to cut costs and consumers opt for cheaper goods and services. So these routine jobs I mentioned earlier, which are easy to automate, they disappeared very rapidly during the Great Recession, and in the United States, they never really came back. And the driver for this is obviously, yes, businesses try to cut costs during economic downturns, but consumers also shift into cheaper goods and services. And that tends to rise the level of automation in the economy. So when you go and shop or buy your food at McDonald's, which uses more labor-saving technology than the average restaurants, you're essentially increasing the overall level of automation in the economy. And as consumers are getting more cash-strapped during recessions, they tend to more cheap goods and services. They tend to increase the level of automation in the economy. In addition to that, I think there are drivers of automation that we haven't seen before. So obviously social distancing is a new experiment robots are helping us with this. They're helping us to deliver food and medicine in hospitals. They're helping us deliver packages to our house. FedEx is now experimenting with robots that can climb stairs. And in addition to that, some of the bottleneck automation are gradually disappearing. So robotic hands are more dexterous, for example. And with machine learning technology, warehouse automation is progressing as well, because the technology is becoming increasingly good at identifying new objects in warehouses which it hasn't seen physically before in those warehouses. And that's been one of the key bottlenecks to warehouse automation. And as we all know, during this crisis, e-commerce has seen a massive boom. The key bottleneck has really been warehouses, where Amazon workers went on strike recently in New York and also in France because of not very good working conditions. Sadly, I think the best way of companies like Amazon's to ensure against something like that happening again is automation technology. Now, looking at the jobs that we see are most at risk, we find that it's not actually the high-skilled, high-income jobs that are at most risk. Yes, document review can be automated. Yes, some medical diagnostics tasks can be automated. That doesn't mean that automation technology is going to replace doctors and lawyers anytime soon. It's more cashiers, the jobs truck drivers, jobs at call centers and so on, that are increasingly exposed to automation technology, and not to mention warehouses. Conversely, and perhaps not surprisingly, we see that the jobs that can be done remotely, that have been relatively safe to automation, are also relatively safe from COVID itself. So high-income jobs are much more likely to be done remotely in financial services, for example, and 80% of jobs, according to our estimates, can be done remotely. In hospitality, which is relatively speaking very low wage sector, less than 15% of jobs can be done remotely. This sort of takes into account sort of sectoral requirements, so the CEOs and financial planners in the hospitality industry whose jobs can be done remotely as well. Now, a key question that you're asking with regard to the future of work, though, is that if many jobs actually be done at distance, will COVID cause the death of distance? Will we get rid of the office, and will people be able to economize on expensive real estate and live in the countryside and telecommute in from their homes? And there is some evidence suggesting that that might be possible. So what you can see in this figure here is the average distance between inventors on the same patent, which you can see increases very rapidly, especially after the development of the World Wide Web in the 1990s. But if you actually look more into the data, you see that many of the collaborators have actually met at some point when important conferences get cancelled. You see a reduction in innovation, which suggests that many of these inventors have actually met in person. And I think the very fact that activities, if anything, has become more clustered since the computer revolution, and this is a study we did back in 2016, where we show that as the first computer-related job titles emerged, economic activity became much more clustered in relatively skilled cities. And there's a reason why all knowledge industries, since Renaissance Florence, Victorian Birmingham in Britain, early 20th century Detroit, contemporary Silicon Valley and Seattle, all of those places have been highly clustered. And I suspect that this is something that is not going to be changed by COVID. A lot of innovation happens through spontaneous in-person type of interactions, and the regional inequalities that we've been seeing in recent decades are likely to persist. So I don't see a reversal there. And that means, again, that this time is not that difference in the sense that people have to adjust by acquiring new skills and also moving to new places where jobs are emerging. And obviously, we need to be very careful in managing that transition to avoid a backlash against technology itself. And with COVID-19 and the recession that we are now in, that is becoming an increasingly hard task. So I think that's probably a good point of opening up for questions. I've probably spoken long enough, so thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Frey. There were some times where, at least for me, your sound was breaking up. So you probably don't have a headset right there, but maybe just, I think it helps if you're a little bit on the loud range.
Okay.
All right, and everybody, feel free to submit questions via the Q&A app, and I will do my best to sort through them. So, Dr. Frey, let me start with maybe a naive question, but I think it's one that a lot of people wonder, is this time different? Has the automation gotten so sophisticated that it's going to really put a larger percent of us out of work than has happened before in previous waves of technological change?
Yes, I think it's important to pick the right episode when looking to the past. So there have been very different episodes of automation. So during the first industrial revolution, which I mentioned during the presentation, we saw a similar hollowing out of middle-income jobs. We saw a similar decoupling between wage and productivity growth. And we saw similar polarization of our societies and a backlash against technology as a consequence. And I think that broadly mirrors what we've been seeing for the past 3 decades or so. The early 20th century experience was very different. And I think key reason for that was the rise of mass production. So automobiles, electrical machinery, electrical appliances created vast new industries for where there was a lot of consumer demand, and a lot of semi-skilled people could simply shift into relatively easy to do factory jobs. And a lot of people were drawn in from agriculture. What we've seen since the age of automation began in the 1980s is that a lot of people have been pushed out from middle-income jobs in the manufacturing industry in similar ways that people were pushed out of domestic industry and these craft jobs during the 18th and 19th century. So I think this time has so far been very similar to the first industrial revolution. Now going forward, is this time different? I think what we see with artificial intelligence is very much a continuation of the trends that we've been seeing for the past 3 decades, which is that automation technology continues to substitute for a lot of work that is unskilled, and it's not just in factories this time, it's in warehouses, it's in transportation, logistics, mines, construction, and so on. And it's also going to create new jobs in skilled professional services and technology industries. And what happens when you create a new job in a tech industry in Sydney is that that person goes out in the local economy, at least before COVID-19, and spends his or her money on services, goes to the hairdresser, goes grocery shopping, takes a taxi, and so on and so forth. That creates around 5 new jobs in the local service economy. And I think that these in-person type of jobs are also jobs that we will continue to see for some time. So, everything that requires in-person interaction is hard to substitute for. And in theory, right, you could just watch your yoga classes online and doing it at home. At least before COVID, most people were happy to go to the gym and see an instructor. And I think there are a lot of these in-person type of services where we simply prefer human interaction. So for that reason, I think that no, this time is no different, at least so far.
Dr. Frey, you had a very powerful graph showing which jobs were most at risk for automation. What about thinking on the other side about where new opportunities will be? How do you think about where the jobs of the future are that are going to emerge?
Yes, I think one other reason why we often have to have many periods of automation anxiety is that it's much easier to conceive the existing jobs that can be replaced than the new jobs that are likely to emerge. And if we could travel back in time and ask our grandparents and our great grandparents in 1900, what do you think that your great grandchildren are going to do for a living? If you would have said, well, I think my son is going to be a yoga teacher and my daughter is going to be a software engineer, and that would strike me as very implausible. And I think in similar ways, we are just as ill-equipped to predict the jobs of the future today. But I think, again, these engineering bottlenecks and some patterns that we see provide some indication. And I think we have, these highly skilled jobs in technology industries, in professional services that are still going to be created. We don't know exactly what they are, but I think they sort of broadly mirror what we see today. And in addition to that, we see, these in-person type of jobs that I mentioned earlier emerging. And I don't know what consumer preferences will look like in 50 years from now and the services that we will demand exactly. But I suspect that there is a lot of things in, whether it has to do with health or whether it has to do with leisure and travel. I mean, all of these sectors obviously are very COVID affected today, but thinking 50 years ahead, I think those are still jobs that are going to be around.
Given the impossibility of predicting the future, as you suggest, what is the right way to think about preparing individuals for successful labor market outcomes in a future where many of the jobs of today will not exist, but we don't know what the new jobs will be? How do we design skills, policy, and systems for that level of uncertainty?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that the likelihood of a child going to college depends very much on who your parents are in most countries. And I think we can try to bridge that, at least in part. So, investment in early childhood education. And Jim Heckman won the Nobel Prize for showing that essentially those investments pay for themselves. Children that get education early in life are much more likely to go to college, much more likely to become inventors, much more likely to participate in the democratic process. So I think we can level the playing field, and I think it's sort of important to focus on these interventions early in life for that particular reason.
What about later in life? There's a very active conversation in Australia about vocational training. People look admiringly on the German model, although I'm sure we idealize it from afar, as always happens. But the varieties of capitalism literature says that organized market economies like Germany do better on specialized skills, whereas liberal market economies like the UK or the US or Australia tend to do better on generalized skills. Um, what is the right way to be thinking about um, upskilling for older people?
Yeah, so first of all, I think there's this notion that can't we all just be Germany, or today some are saying can't we all just be China? And I think it's important to just note the context. So Britain was the first country to industrialize. It industrialized in a very bottom-up fashion. There was very little government involvement. Yes, there were tariffs and all sorts of things across a range of industries. They have very little or nothing to do with industrialization in Britain. So, and today we still see that, United States and Britain, which industrialized in this sort of very bottom-up-ish fashion, tend to be very market-driven economies. Germany took a very different approach to industrialization. It was behind its technological frontier relied a lot more on state capacity, large banks to finance large industrial undertakings. Obviously, Russia, and as Alexander Gerschenkrein noted, the further you're away from the technological frontier, the greater role state capacity and the government will play. And in Russia, sort of the state essentially financed everything, and you see the legacy of that still today. So I think many of these systems that you see in Germany, in Britain, in Russia, in China today, they have very deep historical roots, and we can't just replicate them. And I think that that is a mistake. And if every country could be Germany, I'm not sure if that is desirable, but even if that was feasible, if it was easy, every country would be Germany. So that is more of a side note. I think vocational training is important, but I think a lot of it tends to focus on manufacturing industry. And what we see over the past century and recent decades in particular is that the share of jobs absorbed by manufacturing industry has been consistently shrinking. In Britain, in Germany, in Sweden, in the United States, manufacturing employment peaked around 35%. And in China, in India, in Brazil, it's already peaked below 20%. Even in China, 12.5 million manufacturing jobs have disappeared over the past 4 years or so. So I think by focusing too much on vocational training with regard to manufacturing, at least, we are educating people for the wrong sort of future. And I do think that there is a very strong dividing line with regard to people who have been to college and not, right? It's something you can see very clearly in the data. So I do think that increasing college enrollment is something that's important. I don't mean that everybody has to go to Oxford and it has to apply here. That's not the point. So often, get university professors in favor of higher education. Surprise, surprise. But I do think that there is a clear divide there, suggested by the data in most countries.
Yeah. Yeah, and a college degree, in a sense, can be thought of as preparing people for a very wide range of potential jobs. So in that sense, right, we all are going to tell our kids they should go to uni. A question about universal basic income. Some people believe that as automation and artificial intelligence increases in its power, perhaps it makes sense to plan for a society where the total amount of work that humans do decreases, something that has been dreamed of by certain branches of utopian socialism for centuries. Some people believe may actually be more possible now. Your views on the idea of a universal basic income?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's important to remember that we have developed welfare states, in at least in certain parts of the world, and transfers of those welfare states tend to focus on people on the lower end of the income distribution. So if you simply replace existing welfare systems with a universal basic income, which is received by everyone, you will essentially worsen inequality because you're distributing income from the bottom to the middle and the top of the income distribution. Now, you can certainly put the UBI on top of everything else, but in a country like Sweden, which already has a huge welfare state, I think that would be a very expensive endeavor, and I think not advisable. And more broadly, I don't think it's even desirable. So I'm much more, never understood why there needs to be a U in UBI. I think we need to take the U out of UBI and perhaps go for something more like a negative income tax, which provides a floor of which your income can't fall below and still provides incentives to work. And that may well be something to think about, especially in the aftermath of this crisis, when a lot of the employment subsidies that are put in place expire. That may be something to look into. But the universal basic income as such, and I don't see a strong case for it. And as we've been seeing over the past 2 centuries of automation, labor force participation has been trended upwards rather than downwards. And there is nothing to suggest that that is inevitably going to be the case in the future. But at the same time, we see that there are a lot of things that where automation technology still perform poorly, and I suspect that the quantity of jobs is not going to be a key concern over the next couple of decades.
a question about minimum wages. On the one hand, raising the minimum wage can make some of the lower skilled jobs at least pay a sufficient amount for people to live on them, especially in the service sector. On the other hand, higher minimum wages can accelerate automation and create a bigger incentive to eliminate jobs. How do you balance these?
Yeah, so economists always thought that higher minimum wages would lead to unemployment, and what we've seen in a number of studies now is that they actually lead to higher levels of employment. And that is surprising in the sense that you would think that a lot of jobs that, um, uh, would be done sort of at the wage below the minimum wage would no longer be done then. But I think what the evidence suggests is that companies essentially have market power, right? Because otherwise, there's no way that rising the minimum wage would boost employment. And I think we need to deal more fundamentally with the market power issue. And when the Chicago School was writing back in the 50s, and 60s, they were essentially arguing that monopoly is nothing we need to worry too much about, because when somebody extracts very high profits, other companies will move in and compete away those excess profits. And that was true at the time, but what we're seeing more recently is that that is no longer really happening, and that suggests that there are quite significant barriers to entry for smaller companies, and that is also troubling for the bargaining power of labor, not just because of monopoly power in certain locations, but also because when industries mature at some stage, you're not going to buy a 10th automobile. And the way that the business can then remain profitable is by cutting costs, offshoring some stages of production, automating certain tasks. And during this process, the industry is going to release labor. And if you then don't have new industries emerging, new entry, and new jobs being created, that means that people will face diminishing job options. So I think we need to really sort of deal with the issue that business dynamism has been in decline as a way of also solving and helping the bargaining power of labor. We may have to sort of try to revive labor unions more broadly. There's at least been a sort of trend in the United States that union coverage in decline, spending on corporate lobbying going up during the same period of time. And I think we need to sort of address that imbalance between capital and labor on the one hand, and between startups and new firms entering and incumbents. And I think those are sort of key issues. Minimum wages may help address that to some extent, but it's not really solving the key issue.
Not as fundamental as taking on the problem of monopoly and oligopoly. All right, let me close with a final question. If you take the view that automation is inevitable and also the source of the source of productivity and increased standards of living in the long run, what are the most important policies to accompany automation to make sure that it works for as many people as possible?
So my reading of the evidence is that automation so far has been more of a local problem rather than a national problem. So you have many old manufacturing cities doing very poorly. You have new cities that are essentially exporting professional services globally that are doing tremendously well. And the key issue has been, or is in many ways, the relocation of people from these contracting to cities to expanding places. Now, there are different ways of doing this. One policy I argue for in the book, which Enrico Moretti has argued for as well, is relocation vouchers, and moving from an era with poor employment opportunities to an expanding place can be seen as an investment that requires liquidity up front in order to get a better paid job. Hence, there is a case for subsidizing it, so we can introduce relocation vouchers. Where I grew up in southern Sweden, for example, Malmö was a city that had specialized on building ships, and when the shipyard closed down in the 90s, the city was doing poorly for a long time. And the revival essentially came with a bridge to Copenhagen. So all of a sudden, people could stay put in Malmö, where housing was cheap, commute into Copenhagen, where there was an abundance of jobs. Most people would spend most of their money locally where they lived, which gave a boost to the local service economy there, created a virtual cycle, and is now one of the most dynamic labor markets in Europe, or at least it was before COVID, and they closed the bridge. So what that means is essentially that through smart infrastructure investment, if you can connect declining and expanding places, and make that a feasible commute to work, a lot can be gained through that, because I think the rising cost of housing in these prime locations had really been a hurdle for people, allowing people to move into where new type of jobs are being created. And I think in addition to that, one of the solutions also, we need to build more in those prime locations. I think access to local labor markets where new jobs are being created is absolutely critical.
Okay, Dr. Frey, thank you so much for taking time with us today, for getting up early. This is extremely relevant for the conversations we're having here in Australia about economic recovery. I know I'm going to buy your book. And everyone else, thank you for joining us for today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live.